Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kyle Reed, and I'm one of the fire risk reduction specialists with the Oregon State Fire Marshal's Office, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. So today's presentation, we have Amy Jo Detweiler from the Oregon State University Extension Service to share some information on fire-resistant plants. Amy Jo is a professor in Extension Horticulturist with OSU Extension. Amy is responsible for teaching and outreach in the community in commercial horticulture in the high desert environment of Central Oregon, working with homeowners and green industry professionals. She specializes in sustainable landscape practices, including water-wise gardening, fire-wise landscaping, and backyard food production. She's also responsible for training and managing an active group of Master Gardener volunteers for a tri-county region. Amy Jo, thank you for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Today we're going to talk about some Firewise landscape practices. So here's an overview of what we're going to talk about today, and we're going to touch a little bit on the home ignition zone, landscape design maintenance, and then we'll go into a few of these other things like plant selection and what fire-resistant plant characteristics look like. Before we jump into that, though, I did just want to throw out there was some new research that came out of OSU earlier this year in February. It was an interesting study, and it showed that more than 60% of cross-boundary fires were ignited on private property, and only 28 originated in national forests. So if you have an interest in research like this, it might be a fun study for you to read. They looked at almost 3 decades worth of wildfire data and came up with some interesting statistics related to that. So you might find an interest. You might want to copy down this website or the title of this research study and take a look at that when you have some time. So in brief, I just want to cover some real basics before we launch into more about the Firewise landscaping piece of it. On the left here, you have what's known as the fire triangle, and those are the 3 elements you need in order for there to be a fire present. Take away any one of those 3 elements and the fire goes out. On the right-hand side is what is called the fire behavior triangle, and you can see where weather or topography would influence how fast the intensity and or the spread of a fire. What you can see is between the two, between what it takes to have a fire and what can influence a fire as far as its behavior, the common denominator between those two is going to be fuel. And thank goodness it's one of the few elements we can actually influence or change. So that will be some of our focus today, is how we can influence fuel reduction. So for today's purposes, we're focusing just on plant material and the types of plant material that could burn or contribute to a fuel source. The 2 factors that have emerged as primary determinants in a home's ability to survive a wildfire is a home's roofing materials and the quality of the defensible space. And so today we'll emphasize more on the fire-resistant plant piece of that defensible space. This graphic or diagram shows what's called the home ignition zone, and this is going to be the area surrounding your home or structure. It's broken out into 3 different zones. You have the immediate zone, which is going to be the first 0 to 5 feet surrounding the home. And then the second zone is called the intermediate zone, and it goes from 5 to 30 feet outside the home. And then you have the extended zone, 30 to 100 feet and beyond. Those first 2 zones are ones that are usually the ones we have to really be focusing on to create the defensible space. You want to make sure it's well managed. Oftentimes there's irrigation within those zones. And focusing in on the immediate zone, the general recommendation or rule of thumb there is to reduce any of the fuel source from around the home. So ideally, you're not putting in any plant material that can burn. You're going to be using hardscaping instead, and things that are non-combustible around immediately surrounding the home. Occasionally you can have like a container garden or a basket of annuals, something like that on the front patio or the back porch. But generally speaking, you want to keep it to non-combustible materials directly around the home in that first zone. Well, the next zone would be the intermediate zone, which is the 5 to 30 foot area. This is where you're going to make sure you have good spacing, good design, and where your plants are placed. You're going to want to make sure everything is well maintained, keep vegetation clear. If you have lawn or an alternative to lawn, native grasses, or an alternative ground cover, you want to make sure that stays mowed at 4 inches or lower in this area. And you want to remove what's called ladder fuels, which I'll describe in a minute here. So you want to be really thoughtful in your plant placement. I often get asked about fire resistant plant materials, and folks are under the impression as long as they're using fire resistant plants, design or arrangement of those plants isn't really that important. But it's critical in creating that and keeping that defensible space. So a ladder fuel is going to be any type of plant material, such as branches, shrubs, and understory, that are going to arrange or create fuel and allow fuel to go from being a surface fire to becoming a crown fire. It's generally the higher grasses or the intermediate sized shrubs that are going to be your ladder fuels. And ideally, you want to be removing these ladder fuels or removing those steps of the ladder to break up that continuum of fuel. When it comes to spacing trees on your property, depending on the size of your property or what you're managing, again, that first 5 feet, you would ideally not have any trees in that location. The next area, the 5 to 30 foot zone, you would go ahead, and if you are going to have trees, ideally you're going to have 18 feet between those tree canopies or those clusters of trees. And you can have groupings. You just want to make sure you're allowing for spacing between, again, because you want to break up that continuum of fuel. It's really important to remember mature size when you're planting, whether you're initially planting or if you may have to retroactively go in and reduce what you have going there and take some plants out to try and acquire this distancing recommendation. Here's the recommendations as you move further out. When you get beyond that 30 feet, the tree canopies can become a little bit closer and a little bit closer even further out. But again, you want to try and maintain a well-designed area to reduce that fuel continuum. Here's a good example. This is a landscape, 3 smaller pine trees put in. These are Vanderwolf pines. And you can see when they're young, when you buy them from the nursery, stick them in the landscape, you can see they're young. They look like, oh, there's plenty of room for them. And here, several years later, of course, they've come together and they create this one tree canopy. So all of a sudden you've got a much bigger area that's a continuum of fuel. In that intermediate zone, if you have existing plant material and you need to retroactively try and develop a more Firewise landscape, ideally you want to remove a shrub border. For example, if you have shrubs in that mature size, they spread to about 3 feet wide, then what you would want to do is remove some of those shrubs in between. And ideally, you have double the amount of size as far as the total width of that plant. So a shrub that would get to 3 feet, you'd want to allow 6 feet between the next planting or shrub, or the cluster of plants if you have a cluster of plants. Limbing and pruning, ideally you want to remove any type of tall plant material from beneath the taller trees in your landscape. If you have plant material underneath there, for example, a plant that say gets 3 feet in height, you'd want to limb up to about 9 feet and take out any limbs that are in between that area. This is again to try and minimize the ladder fuels. So here's an example of a tree, a conifer it would be beneficial to remove those lower limbs. They're dead, they're a fuel source. Remove the grasses that are underneath, remove some of the downed branches that are underneath, and just clean up around that area. So here's a side by side. You can see the difference here between the two. On the right hand side, you've got it nice and cleaned out. Arrangement plays a real critical role. In this case, this is a home that was part of what was known as the Skeleton Fire and Bend back in 1996. This homeowner in particular had done some thinning and limbing of trees and had some green space around the entire home. But the fire went around the home, yet unfortunately a firebrand and ember flew over the home and landed in the front section of their home. Right about here, if you can see my cursor, they had a hedge of junipers there. So an ember came and hit that juniper hedge, started a fire, and then because of the arrangement of the junipers around that home, it conveyed the fire up and around the home and end up scorching. You can see the scorch line on the roof. Thankfully, this home was survived because the fire crew was nearby and was able to get in there and put the fire out. Topography, as I mentioned, can play a role in the behavior of a fire, the intensity and the spread of a fire. So depending on if you're on a flat parcel of land or if you're upslope or downslope, you want to be thinking about how much more clearing out you need to do based on that. On flat ground, the smoke and the flame just rises straight up, but as the slope increases, you're going to have preheating of the fuels above the fire, and it's going to cause that fire to preheat those fuels and burn uphill faster. Here's an example of a home that's see some of the clearing that they did surrounding the home. So they've just got hardscaping using some rocks and boulders. They prep the land, remove a lot of the native plant material, limbed up the conifers around that area, and then they can go back in now and plant some other fire resistant plants or native plant material in groupings or clusters, as long as it's outside that 5-foot zone. So defensible space can work if some thought goes into thinking about your landscape design, and again, the arrangement of the plant material and the use of fire resistant plants. Here's an example of the skeleton fire. Again, this was post fire. This home survived. It had a defensible space zone. They had fireproof roofing and siding on their home, but also because of the turf grass area, which has a lot of moisture content in it, and even the ponderosa pine that were surrounding the home. The main part of the fire moved from the left side of the slide to the right, going around this home. It actually burned down the neighbor's garage. It was a really hot, intense fire. And the neighbor's home almost didn't survive as well, but this home was able to survive because of some of the defensible space they had created around their home. What's interesting is to go back, and this is a photo 7 years post-fire in 2003, and you can see those ponderosa pine. You can see they did burn, but the buds survived. And so because the buds survived, it was able to put out new growth the following season and continue to grow. And here's another post 25 years fire. You can see how those pines have matured. There's kind of the 3 different images. You can see how things have changed. And some of those aspen, they've planted some aspen behind those ponderosa pine and some other fire resistant plant materials. For purposes of today's presentation, there's some different definitions of what fire resistant means. Fire resistance from an ecological sense means being able to persist over a long period of time in a fire dominated environment. And the strategies like sprouting and specialized seeds that remained dormant and can come back post fire. But for today's purposes, we're talking about the ability to resist ignition or not sustain combustion. And so that's the definition we're using. When I'm talking about fire resistance, I'm talking about the ability to resist ignition or not sustain long combustion or hot fires. So before we move into characteristics of fire resistant plants, let's talk about some characteristics of plants that would be considered more flammable. And so plant material that's going to have fine, dead or dry material within it, whether it's a natural characteristic of this plant to collect that debris or a part of a plant that's not being well cared for, those are going to be some of the characteristics to avoid in a defensible space around your home. The leaves or twigs of more fire-prone plants can contain waxes, terpenes, or oils. You would see some of this in some of the conifer plant material. Leaves may be aromatic when crushed or brushed against, and the sap of the plant may be resinous, gummy, or kind of sticky, have a strong odor to it. So these are all characteristics of more highly flammable plants. The plant may naturally have loose or papery bark. For example, think of something like a birch that may have a peeling or exfoliating bark to it, those types of characteristics. Here's a classic example of a juniper hedge. It's pretty common in a traditional landscape, but if you get up closer and you were to cut away that juniper hedge, you would see that it accumulates a lot of dead needles. As the needles are done doing their job, they shed or fall off the older part of the branch, and you can see that really creates a fuel source there. Arborvitae is another one that from the outside it would look really green and lush. It would seemingly you could think this seems like a Firewise plant, but if you're to cut away that plant, you would see the collection of the accumulated dead needles that fall off, which is a normal part of the process for a conifer. Here are some of the more fire-prone plants to avoid in both Western Oregon, Central and Eastern Oregon. There's some crossover here, but there's some differences as well. And it's interesting that we're seeing more and more urban wildfires destroy homes and structures. So it's not even, the thought used to be just wildland urban interface, but of course we're seeing examples now of all sorts of urban wildfires causing destruction also. Here's an example of the Oak Knoll fire that was in Ashland in 2010. This one started just an individual started a fire, and you can see the origin here in the slide, and it started to burn that area. The wind direction picked it up, and it actually hopped across the highway there. And unfortunately, it burned 11 homes, and I think a barn was burned as well. One of the primary reasons that it burned was because of the plant materials surrounding these 11 homes, which was Leland cypress. You can see that's what the Leland cypress looks like. So moving on to characteristics of fire-resistant plants and what can help create a better plant choice is going to be ones that have a more broad leaf or deciduous leaf to them. The majority of deciduous plants that drop their leaves in the fall, are going to be considered fire resistant. There's a few broadleaf evergreens as well, like for example, rhododendron, that would be considered fire resistant. But generally, it's going to be a plant that has a leaf that's easily able to be crushed in your hand, is pretty thin texture to it, is moist and supple. Trees that tend to exfoliate in a clean way. So if they're dropping their leaves, they're all coming down and off the plant. They're not being held on the plant or collected within the plant. Plants that tend to have very little deadwood naturally occurring on it. And same with shrubs that would be used for a Firewise landscape, ones that are going to collect minimal dead material within. The sap in plants that are generally considered fire resistant are usually odorless or have very little odor to them. Can fire resistance change within plant material, plant designated as being fire resistant? Can it change? It can. That's what makes it difficult to categorize something as fire resistant, because moisture is a big part of whether or not a plant is fire resistant, and moisture levels in a plant or in the plant material, particularly the foliage, can change seasonally as the summer goes on, as a plant matures, and environmental factors do affect the moisture content within plants. So plants that are in clay type soils will have different moisture content. The exact same plant planted in a sandy type soil would potentially have a different moisture content level from place to place. Here's an example of Western bleeding heart, one of our natives, excuse me, that could be used in a fire resistant landscape. So the purpose behind landscaping with fire resistant plants is to create an attractive landscape while at the same time not adding fire potential or hazard. Here's an example of some aspen that were planted. You can see those in the middle of the slide here, and they're gonna add color, add some nice fall color, be a nice backdrop against the native conifer that are in that landscape, and they're also gonna actually create some fire resistance if a wildfire was to move through. In the forefront of this slide, you can see some saplings that are started to pop up here and over here to the left. Those would need to be removed so you are minimizing those ladder fuels. All that being said, a fire resistant plant is only fire resistant if it's well maintained. And if they are well maintained, how do they work? Well, they can work to help slow down the fire. I'll show you a case study that includes that. They can actually shorten the length of the flame and potentially reduce the amount of heat produced by the fire. But if they're not maintained well, then they can burn just as easily as a fire-prone plant. And so maintenance is a really critical piece of having a Firewise landscape. Here's an example of Delosperma, which is a common name as ice plant. This is one of your better choices as far as having a lot of moisture content for a Firewise plant. Not to be confused with the invasive ice plant. It's a totally different genus than the one that is found in California. So I was asked to do a little bit regarding pruning, and just I'm just going to touch on pruning aspects and how they can impact creating that defensible space and creating a Firewise landscape. So there's a lot of information on the slide, but what I really want to point out to you in brief is the very terminal bud here in this diagram of a branch. In the terminal bud of all plant material on your shrubs and your trees is a hormone, a growth hormone called auxin. And when you the auxin is only found in the terminal bud tip, it's not here in these lateral side buds. So when you remove that terminal bud through pruning, what it does is it it sends these lateral buds into a mad race to become the more dominant terminal growth of that particular branch. And so you'll end up with a lot of side growth happening all at one time. So just keep that in mind. You take off that terminal bud if you do indiscriminate pruning, and you're going to get a lot of side growth. It's going to create a lot of branching and create a lot more density to the plant material, density increasing the fuel source potentially. One other thing I want to mention real quickly here is the further back you go into a plant to prune, the further back into old wood that you go to prune, you may be getting to a place where you're pruning back to where there's no growing points anymore in that part of the plant. And so you have latent buds that are going to sit there and they're not going to do anything or there are no latent buds that exist in that part of the plant. So all that being said, for example, if you prune a tree indiscriminately like this is called topping, and you just removed all those terminal buds, then what you end up with is this type of growth. And unfortunately, this type of growth creates bad branch angles, weak wooded plants, and all of a sudden you've just increased probably more dead wood, a lot more density, and you also now have this stub cut, as you can see where the white arrow is pointing, and that stub cut is actually going to potentially become hold moisture and potentially become filled with plant disease. It's going to create like some plant disease down through the larger limbs of those plants, and you end up with some heart rot occurring at that because of fungal pathogens or bacterial pathogens moving down through that plant. So you're going to end up with dead plant material, and you've just increased that fuel source on that plant because of poor pruning practices. So with pruning, you want to make sure you're using the right pruning tools for the job. As far as bypass pruners or loppers work best in getting a nice pruning cut, and I'll talk about why that's important. And then also the tri-cut pruning saw, it would be the recommended type of saw to use for larger limbs, because with the tri-cut saw, you actually get cut on the pull and the push when you're sawing. Positioning the pruners or the loppers with a bypass pair, you're going to want to make sure that the blade is closest to the part that remains. So if these were flipped around the other way, the pruning cut ends up being further out from the main part of the plant that stays, and that's going to make a difference in how the plant can heal over potentially. So for large limbs of tree pruning, you've got what's called the branch collar, and you can see that it's kind of where the diameter of that limb changes. You kind of have the swollen area here. That's called the branch collar. And that's the pruning line you can see here over on the right. That's where you'd want to make a pruning cut. If you go back further into that branch collar beyond it, into the bark ridge, you're going to actually hinder the plant from making a good compartmentalization or where it heals over. There's actually chemicals in that branch collar that if you make the pruning cut in the right area, it'll allow the plant to heal correctly, and it'll keep the bacteria out of the plant as it continues to heal. So the wound wood that develops when you have an improper cut, or you go back too far in, or if we go back here, if you go too far out, if you're pruning way up here, you're going to end up having wound wood that doesn't develop evenly, and potentially you're going to get a bacterial fungal infection as well that can move through that plant. So again, you're adding to that fuel source if you're going to end up with dead wood there. Importance and properly pruning on that branch collar, as you can see here, if you do the right type of pruning cut over time, this is a wound closure over a 10-year span. You can see every year, if you go back, that callus tissue will actually develop, and eventually it will close at given time to complete closure there. So again, related to Firewise Landscaping, how does that play a role? Well, for example, with these conifers, the intention here was good to shape and minimize the size of the conifer, but unfortunately, this is an example of one of those plants. As I mentioned, if you go too far back into that wood, there's no growing points this far back into that wood on both this Colorado blue spruce cultivar, I call it a sprucicle or spruce on a stick, and the mugo pine there to the left. Both of those, the pruning has gone too far back. So now what you've created is dead wood, and that dead wood's going to remain in that plant. There's not going to be any new growth coming from those areas because they don't have buds back that far. Same goes for some of your shrubs. It's important to know what type of shrub you have and knowing how to prune it so that you don't increase the dead wood and create a hazard plant. So cane growers are pruned differently than subshrubs, which are pruned differently than permanent framework plants like rhododendrons. For example, a cane grower, you can go all the way back to the ground and remove the oldest canes. For example, thinning such as this to actually remove, open up, create some airflow. There's a lot of advantages to properly pruning this plant. Permanent framework plants, if you go back too far, for example, in a rhododendron, they can't renew themselves from the base. So it's important to know the type of plant and why you're pruning it as such. So again, the condition of the plant within a landscape is really make sure that the plant is properly maintained and watered and kept healthy so that it keeps those fire resistant plant characteristics going. Here's an example just to show the importance of how a fire resistant plant can act in a case study here. This was Aubrey Butte Fire in Bend back in 2007. A wildfire broke out on this construction site when sparks from cutting a pipe or rebar ignited dry fuels. The fire burned bitter brush, sagebrush, and a mix of pine up and across this slope. And you can see then it kind of exploded, igniting some native plant material. Like you can see how close it is to the homes here. Post-fire, you can see some of the plant material that was burned. Some of these plants that have were completely consumed by the fire were mugo pines. So those would be fire-prone plants. And you can see some other conifers here that were consumed by the fire. So they burned for a long time and were hot. The radiant heat from that, you can see started to peel the paint and scorch the side of the home here. And some of the other plant materials that were here, this is the home next to the one I just showed you. This is Arctic willow. Arctic willow would be considered a fire resistant type of plant, and they had a border or a shrub border of these Arctic willow. Well, the fire moved from the left to the right here. The heat was directed upslope to the home and just kind of moved up with the wind, kind of carried it up in this direction. But you can see the shrub border here of Arctic willow. Get a close up of that. So it wasn't that the Arctic willow didn't burn. It in fact did burn, but you can see that the burn actually slowed the fire down in this case because willows contain a good amount of moisture in the leaf tissue. And so it acted more like a shield in this case. And if you were to go to the other side actually of this shrub border, you can see in one part of the landscape, they actually had mugo pine on the back side. And thankfully the willow actually slowed the fire down enough so the fire crew could get there and put it out before pines, which would be a fire prone plant. So it absorbed that convective and radiant heat without combusting, which was worked well as far as a fire resistant plant. We see a similar situation here. This is again the first home I showed you. Off here in the left corner is mugo pine, which were completely consumed, but the aspen here, again, the aspen burned, but they acted more like a shield, blocking some of that heat from the home. There's another view of that. Here's an example of a defensible space. This is a retired fire chief in the Bend area, and you can see an example of creating a defensible space around the home. You've got some hardscaping here initially in the front, non-combustible building materials for the home. And then you have some hardscaping with boulders and just low growing plant material. So low growing ground covers, low growing shrubs are used in this first 5 to 30 feet. Turf grass area is going to be a ground cover that's going to be more fire resistant. And then if you move back a little further as you start to transition further out, then some of the native plant material that's left in there, you can see how that transitions. These homeowners also included a pond that was put in to provide the firefighters with a water source to fight a potential fire. And here's another view of that home where you can see fuel reduction within the pines. The trees have been limbed up and thinned. You can see the grass is maintained lower. So moving on to resources available, we get a lot of requests for information on fire resistant plant material. And I let folks know that the challenge is when I did this publication, helped to write it, the fire resistant plant publication back in 2005, 6. At that time, there was not a lot of research on fire resistant plant material that was done. And here we are, 2022, and there still hasn't been a tremendous amount of research done on fire resistant plant material. And there's a lot of reasons why that is. Part of it is just the expense involved in testing plants for fire resistance. Obviously, to do the research, you're growing up plants and then you're lighting them on fire to see how they burn, and you're measuring a variety of different factors to put a flammability rating on that plant. And so that's expensive to be using all those plants to do that. We have more research or information on plants that are native to the area just because of wildfires moving through our native environments, but less information on ornamental plant material or cultivated plant material that you'd want to buy at a nursery. And so there has been some other research that's been done since this publication was first written, but there hasn't been a tremendous amount as you might expect, as you would see with other types of research in different areas. So for this particular plant guide, we just used plant material we could find research on the plant flammability, and we didn't include anything where we couldn't find research. There's a lot of other resources out there that may just give you plant lists based on characteristics of fire resistant plants and use the characteristic piece to try and determine whether or not something is fire resistant. We also have information on the home ignition zone if you want to learn more about that, and I have both of those websites listed here. The inside of the fire resistant plant guide, it's a pictorial plant guide that will list the plant and show a picture and the characteristics of that plant. And I'm currently rewriting this. It will be out this year. Hopefully in the next couple of months, we'll have the final publication out and available to you. So it'll be a revised fire resistant plant guide for home landscapes for the Pacific Northwest. And I did add probably about 50 new plants to the guide we were able to include this time around. If you want to look for more information on fire resistant plants, my recommendation if you're doing a Google search is type in fire resistant plants, use this qualifier, the word site :edu, and that's going to bring up research-based information for you. Fire resistant landscape plants for the Willamette Valley, there's a publication out by OSU as well. If you live on the west side of the mountains, you can utilize this. And additionally, there was a study done in Idaho, in southern Idaho, called Fire Resistant Plants Master Database. Inside this guide is a lot more ornamental type plant material, so that was nice, and that they included cultivated varieties that are more common that you would find in a nursery setting. And you can see what they measured here to give a plant flammability rating was mineral content, moisture content, oil content, and they measured height and width. The guide's nice in that it makes suggestions on how far out from the home you should use certain plants based on the fire resistance score that it received. There's also what's called the plant selector that's out of the Midwest. Ohio State University was the lead on that one. And some of the things they looked at in giving a flammability rating was the 4 items I have listed here. So just now I'm just going to move into fire resistant plants and talk about some of the plants listed in our publication. But before we go into that too much, in general, plant selection, some of the items that I really want to emphasize that need to be thought about before you purchase plants, if you're adding to the landscape, is going to be think about mature size in particular so that you don't end up having a fuel continuum because you didn't think about mature size when you first put them in the ground, and now you're having to prune the plant in a funny way or take a plant out because it's just gotten too big for the space. And then also think about, make sure it's a non-invasive plant for your region. One of the challenges in doing a guide like the fire resistant plant guide is that we have so many different growing areas, and that it's hard to have everything be all inclusive. And so looking for plants that are non-invasive, and if you're not sure about it, make sure you ask somebody in your local region to make sure you're not going to purchase something that's going to be invasive for your area. So I just start with the lowest growing types of plants that are considered fire resistant and move on up from there. So ground covers like woolly thyme, there's a lot of really small, short growing thymes that can be used. This can be an alternative ground cover that's also steppable, full sun, real drought tolerant. The ones I'm using in this to show you are going to be ones that are on the more drought tolerant side too, as we need to consider the serious drought that we've been in for several seasons. Some people will use woolly thyme as an alternative to turf grass in an area. And you can see this is a home here we had on one of our garden tours, and you can see how extensive it really can be carpet-like. Now, this is not a good example of having the plant go up to the home, but I just wanted to show you how it can present itself as a ground cover. Snow in summer, this is also going to be a full sun ground cover. And I wanted to highlight this plant just to show you that Plants that have silvery or silvery gray foliage to them are naturally more drought tolerant or drought resistant. Having that silvery gray appearance to them is generally an indication of a plant being more water wise. So with the bloom and creeping phlox is going to be another good ground cover. That's the pink one in this photograph. Lots of different color choices for creeping phlox, and this would be one where it'd be good to make sure that you're maintaining this one because you can get some dieback on them if you just let them go. So once it's done blooming, you go in, you're gonna kind of clip that back so you keep it fresh. Sedum or stone crops are really excellent, one of the best or better fire resistant plants, and there's a lot of different choices. There's both cultivated variety sedums and we have native sedums in the area as well. So you can use these. You can see they take hot, dry conditions, different flower colors, and different foliage colors as well to add some interest to the landscape. There's a close-up of one of them that has a yellow bloom, and this one has more a reddish tinge to the foliage. Close-up of the blossom. I mentioned Delosperma earlier. It's another one that has a very succulent foliage to it, a lot of moisture, and stays really low to the ground. And there's lots of different varieties of Delosperma that can give you a variety of different flower colors. Here's the hardy yellow ice plant, purple ice plant's a little less hardy on the left here. Fire spinner ice plant. You know, the only thing I would say about this photo is, of course, there's pine needles covering it. You'd want to remove those, but it's a nice option as well. Pine leaf penstemon is one of many, many penstemon that can be used in a fire resistant landscape. That's the one that's in bloom here. It's kind of reddish orange. You can take a look at that up close. It's one of the longer blooming penstemon as well. It can bloom for about 6 weeks and comes in different cultivated varieties. You can have yellow blooming or orange blooming ones as well, full sun. Here's one of our native penstemon, Richardson's penstemon. Has, again, that silvery gray foliage I talked about is an indication of drought tolerance as well. A close-up of the blossom. Yarrow, I put yarrow in here. Now you want to try and avoid plants that easily reseed or going to become problematic for you, but there are yarrows that won't reseed on you and spread like crazy. And so again, in the new fire resistant plant guide we'll have out, I'm going to list the ones that are recommended that can be used that'll stay put. But some people do like to use yarrow as an alternative ground cover. So our native Western yarrow, for example, would be a good drought tolerant yarrow that could be mowed down and just kept as a low growing ground cover. Blue flax is another native, another water wise choice for fire resistant plants. Daylilies can be used as a fire resistant plant, and of course they come in a variety of colors. Red hot poker can be used, and they also come in a variety of heights. So you want to be thinking about that as well. Yucca, there's different types of yucca that can be used that are more drought tolerant and fire resistant. So for something like this, again, going back to the maintenance point, once this is done blooming, those stalks can get kind of dried out. You want to go in and you'd want to cut those down and not wait to do that till later in the season. There's a lot of different Daphne that can be used. This is Carol Mackey Daphne. Close up of the bloom. Lilacs in general, the common lilac, purple or white, they get a little bit larger in size, so you'd want to be placing those further out in a Firewise landscape. But there's the French hybrids that stay smaller in size, and you could use one of those as well. And lilacs are one of the fewer ornamentals that, even though they have a large bloom and very showy flower, once they're established in a landscape, they're real drought tolerant over time. Lewis's mock orange is a native shrub, and you can see full sun gets that excellent fragrant bloom to it. It has more of a wild growth habit to it, but this would be another native Firewise plant choice. And the pollinators love that one too. Red twig dogwood or Rhodosiae dogwood is another one of our natives that can be used. There's a close-up of the flower. This one could do full sun to part shade, and there's the fruit. Birds like the fruit on that. And then it's known for providing winter color or texture too. And there's a lot of shrub dogwoods that fall into this category that they have either red twigs or yellow twigs or kind of a mixture in between the two to provide some nice winter texture. Again, you would want to, this is one of those cane bearing shrubs that I that I mentioned. So for pruning, you could go all the way back to the ground on this, or you would just prune out the old larger branches to keep it opened up a little bit more. On the right is Kelsey dogwood. It's a low growing, rounded growth habit dogwood. It's dwarf variety. So that's a nice option too, if you're a little bit closer in that 5 to 30 foot zone around the home. Another native that's drought tolerant fire-wise would be golden currant. And we've got several other currants that are native. And then also Western spirea, and they like a little bit more moisture, but you can see the close-up of the blossom here. It gets a pink flower on it later in the summer. Again, for something like this, here it is going into fall color. Once those flowers are spent, I'd be going back in and trying to prune some of that out. Moving into trees, we have the red maple hybrids. And again, you have to be countering this to make sure, you want to avoid plants like, potentially, depending on where you live in the state, like Norway maple would be considered invasive in certain areas. Just make sure you're getting the right species if you're purchasing for your area. Make sure you're using things that are not going to be invasive. So the red maple hybrids can be a nice option, and there's a lot of different cultivated varieties that can be used close up of the leaf in fall. Aspen work in some parts of the state better than other places, but that can be a nice fire resistant plant. The thing to be cautioned with about aspen is they are geared to create groves. And so if you're using aspen, know that you're not going to end up with just a single trunk plant. You're going to end up with a grove. That's how aspen grow. So you need to have the space in the room, and you need to think about where it would be placed in the defensible lands, in a Firewise landscape in that defensible space. You'd want to be putting that further out. Close up with a leaf. Swedish aspen is another one that could be used. It has a more upright, narrow growth habit, doesn't spread as wide at maturity, and has a little bit different fall color to it. Again, this one will create a grove as well, not as extensive, but it will over time. Crab apples can be used in some parts of the state. If you're in the tree fruit growing region of the state, you're likely not going to use crab apples, or aren't even supposed to grow the crab apples or backyard apple trees. But in parts that you can use it, this is a nice drought tolerant, fire resistant plant. This one in particular, spring snow, is really nice because it's sterile and doesn't produce the fruit, has an amazing white blossom on it, fragrant, and the pollinators love it. And then we've got other varieties, the crab apples, hundreds and hundreds of varieties that with different growth habits. I just showed this one is royal raindrops, different flower color, and has a teardrop shaped growth habit to it. Our native chokecherry, full bloom, that can be, usually it ends up being a multi-stem large shrub or tree. And the cultivated variety of that would be Schubert chokecherry that has maroon or reddish foliage during the growing season. And serviceberry is a really excellent choice for a fire resistant landscape. It just has a nice canopy to it. It's not too dense. It doesn't hold any type of dead wood. And it comes in both tree form and shrub form. There it is in bloom on the left, leafing out in the summer on the right. White flowers followed by edible fruit that you can use for jams or jellies or wine if the birds don't get it first. And then you've got some nice fall color with a serviceberry. And again, we've got some native serviceberry in shrub form as well that can work well in a landscape. Okay, and on that, I am done and happy to take questions.
All right, thank you for that. We have several questions here in the chat. I'll go through those, and we'll work on answering those together. So the first question we had asked about the research that you mentioned right at the beginning of the cross-boundary fires, where they could find that. And we posted a link to that paper in the chat, so people can scroll up and find that.
Thank you.
There was a couple people asking about where they could find this presentation later on. So just as a reminder, this is being recorded, and we will email the link out to that recording to everybody who registered for this. And it's also posted on OSFM's website. We had another question on here about how are fires able to cross the roads, and why wouldn't the fire stop at the road? We also posted a link to one of our previous webinars that talked quite a bit about this. There's a link there again, so please go back and review that. A lot of that has to do with embers and the spotting of fires in front of itself. We had a little bit of a conversation, maybe you can address this, talking about hardscaping and what that means and how to do that.
Yeah, so what I mean by hardscaping is anything that adds value, like aesthetic value to the landscape, makes it look pretty, that doesn't require water to survive, so a non-living. So those are going to be permeable pavers, boulders, statuary, yard art. Those types of things are going to be considered hardscaping. And I didn't touch on this, but it reminds me that, we didn't talk about mulching materials used to keep moisture in, and you want to avoid wood bark mulches around the home in a Firewise landscape, and use things like gravel would be considered hardscaping around the home. Something like that, again, that's just going to help do a job, or add aesthetic value without needing water or care.
So that leads right into our next question, and it was asking about inorganic mulch in the immediate and intermediate zones, and how to maintain weed control with inorganic mulch areas without herbicides.
Yeah, so inorganic mulches such as gravel or stones or rocks, if you were using something like that, depending on where you live, you could potentially use the right kind of weed barrier. And I say the right kind of weed barrier because there's a lot of different weed fabrics or cloths that are sold that don't do the job, in my opinion. And if you buy the right type of weed barrier, which would be a polywoven type that actually has like a weave to it, then that can last in the landscape for a long time. Now, it would be a plastic material, so whether or not you want to purchase something like that is up to you as an individual to make that decision. But those types of weed barriers can work really well for a long period of time. Eventually, you're going to get kind of some dirt and debris that come in over the top of the gravel and work their way down, and you'll end up with weeds on top of the barrier. But it takes a long time for that to happen, and they can be really effective. But some of the alternative types of weed fabric or cloth I've seen that can be purchased in places, weeds can pop right through them because they're not strong enough, or they don't allow water to flow through them and air, which can create a different problem. So you just want to make sure you're buying the right type of weed barrier for use something like that under gravel. That's going to be your best option that I'm aware of without having to use herbicides for weed management.
All right, we had one here. We have an individual who wants to replace a Mugo pines with another conifer in their urban yard, and asked if a dwarf Norway spruce that was small and globe shaped would be okay to use.
So when I get asked about can I use a conifer, because they do add, there's an element to using a conifer that is different than using any other type of plant, just that you have that year-round interest, yet kind of different texture, different foliage color that can really increase the value, the aesthetic value of the landscape. And uh, if I was to give you a blanket statement, the recommendation would be not to use the conifers because they really tend to be fire prone, not fire resistant. But that being said, I think if you choose to use one, just make sure the placement of it is far enough away from your home or structure, and that it's not surrounded by a fuel continuum, so that it's kind of isolated in the way that it's presented. Maybe there's just a few low growing succulents or ground covers around it if you want a cluster of plants. And then again, just making sure that it's well cared for so you don't see dieback on that.
So real similar to that question was another, can size and density of flammable trees increase fire resistance?
Can you repeat that, please, Kyle? An increase a density of fire.
Yeah, the question says, can size and density of flammable trees increase fire resistance?
I'm not aware of that. If now some of the examples that I showed you of plants that are considered to be fire resistant can, shield some of the heat and slow down the fire. But if you have a big cluster of fire prone plants, I would think that, that would not be the recommendation. You'd want to do some retrofitting there to clean that out.
We had a question about the 2006 edition of the Fire Resistant Plant Guide, and the question was, after publishing, was there any findings or recommendations that at the time did not actually come true, or changes that were made in recommendations?
Yeah, so one of the recommendations is the home ignition zone. If you look in our existing guide, that information is now dated in that guide. They have since found that the recommendation now has changed, because there was a time when there wasn't a strong recommendation necessarily to not have plants close to the home or up against the home. And now the recommendation would be not to have anything in that first 5 feet. And so our diagram, for example, in that particular publication is dated, which is why we're anxiously trying to get an update out there. So yeah, and then, there's always risk when you put out a plant list such as this one, that people are going to come back and say, well, this is invasive in this area. And I'm aware of that. The challenge is the guide was intended for 3 states, and there's going to be some differences in what you can grow where and what's invasive in what part of the state. And so there are plants that are in our 2006 guide that I'm going to take out in the 2022 guide, just because maybe that plant has shown up on more invasive plant lists since then. And it's just, even though there's parts of the state that plant can be grown, for example, burning bush is a good example of that. Burning bush is not invasive where I'm from in Central Oregon. It actually it can struggle to grow here, but that can be considered invasive in other parts of the Pacific Northwest. So I'm just going to take it out of the plant guide and just not include it, because it will probably cause more grief than it's worth to put in. Unfortunately, like I said, because there's not a lot of extensive research and fire resistance or flammability rating for ornamental plant material, every time we take a plant like that out, or I'm doing a better job in this guide of actually explaining or putting right up front, this plant may be invasive in some areas, check with local experts on whether or not to include, so that people are aware, oh, okay, I should check and make sure I'm getting the right type of species. Because it could be that some genus, for example, cotoneaster is a genus, that there are some invasive species of cotoneaster in certain parts of the state. But then there are other species that are not invasive of cotoneaster. So it's just about learning what plants are invasive and which ones are not in the same genus.
All right, our next question here is asking about the updated plant guide, and will that include any HIZ spacing and maintenance recommendations? And the other part of that was, is there going to be any information in there on which of those plants listed are deer resistant?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? Are there any plants that are deer resistant? Yes, all that's going to be included. We're going to include updates to the home ignition zone. We're going to talk about maintenance, and each of the plant profiles are going to include whether or not. So we'll talk about the obvious, like recommended light conditions, sun or shade, the water use requirement for the plant in general. And then we'll also have whether or not it attracts pollinators, attracts birds, attracts butterflies, and whether or not it's deer resistant. And, I always kind of give the caveat with deer resistance, nothing's deer proof. It really depends on that particular season, whether or not something has food available to it. But these are going to be plants that tend to be they can either sustain deer browsing, or they tend to be more deer resistant in general.
The next question we have asks about decorative grasses, beach grass, and bamboo, and if you can address those.
Yeah, I will not. So the ornamental grasses that's a tough one, because again, they add some really cool texture and dimension to a landscape, but we will not be including them because, generally speaking, the way that ornamental grasses grow end up contributing directly to those fuel letters that we mentioned during the presentation. So those will not be included. That being said, as I mentioned, for example, with like a specialty conifer that was asked about, if you're doing a cluster further out in that intermediate zone or even in the extended zone, it's not that you can't use them at all, but you want to be really careful how you're using them and making sure they're not going to add to that continuum of fuel. And so, but I won't be including those in because there's no research to support the use of ornamental grasses. And I would think that ornamental bamboo would potentially fall into that category again because of the way it creates groves as well.
We had a question about some common ground covers and your thoughts on those within that 5 to 30 feet area. So some of the examples they gave was English ivy and St. John's wort. Is that something that's suitable in that area or not?
Well, unfortunately, English ivy is considered invasive in certain parts of the state. Now, the St. John's wort, I'd have to look up if that's considered invasive or not, because it's not something that grows where I'm from over here, but the English ivy would not be one that's recommended.
We have a question about ponderosa pine. They have about, let's see, they have intermingled crowns. How do I determine the distance between the trees in the 30 to 100 foot zone?
how do you determine the distance? Like, where are you measuring from? Is that I don't want to make sure I'm understanding that question.
Yeah, the way I read the question, it sounds like they have clusters of ponderosa pine where they're all intertwined at the crown. So how would they, space those off or clump those off?
Yeah, and Kyle, if you know the answer to this, please jump in because I feel like there's an actual step on how to do this, and I don't recall it off the top of my head on how to make that measurement. But it's something I could find for you because I've heard it before myself, but I don't recall it off the top of my head. So good question. I don't know.
All right. I think that looks like it wraps up our questions that we have for the presentation. Amy, I want to thank you for sharing this information today. This was a great presentation. And thank you to everybody who took their time out today to join us. We're also posting all of our webinar recordings on our website under the Fire Adapted Oregon page. So thank you again for joining us today. We hope you found the information helpful and informative. Please reach out if you have any other questions. You can reach us at crr@osp.oregon.gov. Thank you, everybody, and have a good day.